Greetings to friends from Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas. I am Harold D. Weaver, Jr., your host. Our Black Quaker Project Ministry of Wellesley Friends Meeting, New England Yearly Meeting of Friends, welcomes you to this opening session of the second Black Quaker Lives Matter Film Festival and Forum, co-sponsored by the American Friends Service Committee. We're happy that you made the decision to be with us today as we honor the life and legacy of the little-known Bill Sutherland, 1918 to 2010, a nonviolence advocate, AFSC leader and collaborator, imprisoned conscientious objector, and friend and active supporter of African liberation and African American freedom fighters. We hope that your experience with us today will be educational, provocative, and evocative. With this year's Film Festival Forum, we are hoping to continue tackling head-on some of the concerns, problems, issues facing people of color worldwide, with special appreciation to their allies. We're joined by several special guest experts: AFSC General Secretary Joyce Ajune, AFSC Northeast Regional Director Keith Harvey, and author, historian, close friend of Bill Sutherland, Dr. Matt Meyer. Welcome to all of you. We're grateful for your presence. Joyce, let me first express my deep appreciation to the AFSC for co-sponsoring this Black Quaker Lives Matter Film Festival and Forum for the second year in a row. Thank you also for accepting our invitation to serve as a guest expert here today. Joyce Ajlune has served as the General Secretary of the American Friends Service Committee since September 2017, overseeing the organization's worldwide efforts for peace with justice. As a Palestinian-American Quaker leader, Joyce has been a seeker of refugee rights, gender equality, and economic aid throughout the long career in international development. She is a member of the Ramallah monthly meeting and attends several monthly meetings in the USA. Joyce, thank you very much for joining us today. Welcome to Keith. Keith B. Harvey has been a regional director of the American Friends Service Committee since 1992. First as New England Regional Director and later as Northeast Regional Director as the geographical entities expanded and the number of regions shrank. He has led workshops on nonviolence training, criminal justice history, and the international debt, sat on the Philadelphia Planning Committee for the U.S. Social Forum, and served as both member and chair of the Louis D. Brown Peace Institute Board of Directors. Keith currently sits on the Massachusetts Peace Action Board and works with the Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign Coordinating Committee. He is an active volunteer participant in New England Yearly Meeting of Friends annual sessions. Keith, thank you for joining us today. Welcome to Matt. Matt will be joining us shortly. He is currently in Ghana or between Ghana and Burkina Faso. Meanwhile, Dr. Matt Meyer is an internationally noted author, historian, and organizer for over 30 years. His publications include Guns and Gandhi in Africa, Pan-African Insights on Nonviolence, Armed Struggle, and Liberation in Africa, co-authored in 2000 with our honoree, Bill Sutherland. He is the Senior Research Scholar of UMass Amherst's Resistance Studies Initiative and currently serves leadership roles with the International Fellowship of Reconciliation and the War Resisters League International. Matt, thank you for joining us from Ghana, West Africa. I will now invite Matt to introduce our film, an interview with Bill Sutherland, after which there will be a dialogue among our guest experts, Joyce, Keith, and Matt. As I mentioned, Matt is in West Africa. As a precautionary measure, we asked him to send a video recording that we could use in case he had problems getting on because of technology. So we're going to now rely on that video to introduce, for Matt to introduce the film. Matt, the floor is yours.
Greetings. If you're seeing this video, it means that my connections in Burkina Faso, in West Africa, didn't quite get us to great Wi-Fi in time for this program. However, I'm taping here because it's a privilege and a tremendous excitement to introduce and to spotlight and to celebrate the life and work of Baba Bill Sutherland, who played a special role for many years as my mentor, then as my collaborator and co-author, and then as my stepfather, and as he and my mom had a surprise relationship in the last 7 years of their life. The fact of the matter is that Bill was an influencer before that term was popular. He influenced people on many continents over many decades for many different reasons. This interview that you'll be seeing in a few minutes and the conversation that you'll hear that follows will talk about Bill and his legacy, not just Bill the man, because I can say with great certainty that he would have hated too much of a spotlight on just himself. Part of the reason that his book became our book, and the reference he makes at the beginning of the interview you're about to see, of coming to the States to collaborate with an author, was me, many decades his junior, not from the experience of a person from recent African descent, although we're all descendants of the motherland in one way or another. But that book became a co-authored book, a collaboration between Bill Sutherland and myself, Matt Meyer, because he said, we don't need another biography. We don't need another autobiography. We don't need just to tell my story, although his story had extraordinary, fascinating elements. What we need is an investigation into the key concerns that I and you, Matt, have had all of our lives. The concerns about strategies and tactics for effective social change, for liberation, for decolonization, for revolution in as non-violent a way as we can make it. And so this interview, coming to you from about 11 years before Bill passed, is an interview that focuses on his World War II years as a conscientious objector and as a Christian pacifist. And that's appropriate for us as the Black Quaker Network continues some of those traditions, but also continues the traditions that were central to Bill's life in terms of building a true internationalism, a deep decolonization that goes beyond what we did in the 20th century, beyond what Bill could imagine or work for, but a 21st century movement of movements for social change. Now, the video, which I won't repeat any of the interview you're about to see, was done by Judy Ehrlich for the film on World War II COs, The Good War and Those Who Refused to Fight. And of course, central to Bill's life was his jail time as a World War II conscientious objector. He'll tell you a lot of that story, and he'll just make mention of the life that followed, his life as a profound Pan-Africanist. But if you get to the end of the video, you'll hear him say that the goal, in some ways, the way to live, is to love life love life enough to struggle. To love life enough to struggle. And in fact, if there's an enduring legacy of Bill, aside from his humility and his deep internationalism, it is that sense that love is a driving force to the struggle we have to make, if we're loving people, to make the world better than the way we found it. Now, after World War II, after his release from prison, after he met the group of African students that urged him to come as a young man of African ancestry, of African descent, to the motherland to see all that was going on in the late 40s and 50s. As he did that, Bill became, from 1953, when he moved to the Gold Coast, what was to become Ghana, till the time he moved back to the U.S. in 2003, he was the people's ambassador. He was an informal, person-to-person ambassador in a way that no nation state could possibly imagine. This meant some specific ambassadorial duties. In 1958, when Gold Coast was to become Ghana, when Kwame Nkrumah was to proclaim independence, in that dramatic and amazing ceremony, many black leaders from around the U.S. and, of course, Africans from around the continent were there. But Bill was one of those small group of African Americans based in Accra that said this young minister, this guy named Martin, and his wife Coretta, needed to be invited along with the older, more well-known official black activists. So it was because of Bill and others that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King were invited to those ceremonies in Accra, Ghana, in the late 50s. Some years later, when Bill had moved to Dar es Salaam, he was the chauffeur, the driver, and the host, one of the hosts, of Minister Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, when he traveled through Dar in the last year of his life. So from Martin to Malcolm and well beyond, Bill's ambassadorial duties were very specific and very broad. But beyond that, as you'll hear later from some of our representatives from the Quaker community and the American Friends Service Committee, Bill continued in those services as a great representative of AFSC in Southern Africa, and fundamentally as a representative of people's movements for building movement-to-movement people's power. At the end of the video, Bill also talks about the work we have to do against tremendous odds, the work against actual warfare and institutional violence, always an understanding that peace, true peace, had to be the product of justice, and that institutional violence, as much as just plain warfare, have to be at the center of our work. And so enjoy this video. Understand that after this video, Bill had many more years of deep life and work that he was engaged in, including the publication of Guns and Gandhi in Africa, which if you haven't read, we hope you can still read it. I was a poor author at that time, but Bill's vision and story, his humanity and his perspective shine through, like I hope they shine through in this interview as well, where all of you who knew him can get a smile at seeing his face again, and those of you who did not know him can enjoy learning about some of the radical, broad, and still very relevant perspectives of MZ Baba Bill Sutherland.
Cooper, thank you very, very much for editing down this video and adding all those photographs. You did a brilliant job, a brilliant job. Thank you very much. Keith, please take it from here for the dialogue of the experts.
Okay. I just want to say welcome to everybody. I am amazed at all the folks who have joined us here, and I'm honored to be part of this. All those monthly meetings I see up on the chat, so I'm excited to be able to do this. We are going to be presented with 3 questions about Bill, his life, and his impact with friends, with the service committee, and looking at the future. And so we are going to speak to that question, to the 3 questions, and then we'll open it up for you to have a little bit of dialogue, have a little conversation, as you all can ask further questions about Bill and his impact on the society. And so I guess we'll begin. I guess I have the privilege to start us off with the first question. And so I guess, Cooper, you're going to flash up the first question for us. So what I need to answer is, what is the relationship between AFSC and Bill Sutherland? And what is Bill Sutherland in context of AFSC? And so I'm going to start. I have a little PowerPoint. That's the only way I'm going to stay on time and to be able to say what I need to say. I will begin this little thing. And so bear with me for just a second. And I will try to do from here. And so let me first start by saying there is so much history with Bill and the American Friends Service Committee, and it's an incredible relationship, and that it will be impossible to do justice. But I will do my best to answer the questions before me with broad strokes. I have this PowerPoint to help tell the story with some pictures, and hopefully we'll be able to offer it back to the project as we move forward. And so as I begin to set the table, I want to say it's, I often use the word Sankofa, to learn from the past, to be able to take those learnings to help us build for the future. And so setting that table is, we heard so much from Bill about his life, and service committee's involvement though, and Bill in Africa sort of went back to the 50s in the context of the Algerian War for Independence in North Africa. And sort of that rising movement, freedom movement, also in white-ruled Southern Africa. And so there was this informal intersections between peace activism and the opposition to racism in the United States and around the world. And Bill was a key figure in all these efforts, as you heard, and bringing these 2 struggles sort of together and understanding the intersectionality of those struggles. I do want to say that Bill's relationship with the service committee, I was, running through the archives, and, shortly after he graduated from college, he was he kind of worked for AFSC's Student Peace Service Program in the 40s, in the summer of 1940, actually. And as we heard, shortly after that, he ended up spending 4 years in prison as a conscientious objector. But his relationship with the Congress, the the Congress for Racial Equality also brought together Bill Sutherland and also Hauser during this independence movement, and also Bynard Rustin. And so Bynard Rustin also back then was part of the service committee. He ultimately was on the executive committee. He was part of the writing of Speak Truth to Power. And so there's this relationship that came about with the service committee. But I do want to say that, you know, his letters, Bill's letters, and all of these different organizations working around the struggles for liberation in Africa, Bill was a major part of. And that this was something that in the very beginnings, the service committee began its work, and it really began with sort of representatives sort of going over there doing extended trips. And from the very beginning was Douglas and Dorothy Steele, who first forged some relationships with these trips. But soon after, it was Bill's connection and hospitality with Lyle Tatum, and later Jim Bristol, to build their closer ties with African nationalists. And this is one of those things that were really important. As you can see Jim Bristol over here to the side, and also Tony Henry was over in Africa as part of the service committee's ongoing doing work and doing development work, and also building schools and being able to do some of these education projects out there. And so that's sort of my very broad stroke of sort of setting the table, because then what began to happen is what I call the major work of the sort of the late 70s, 80s, and 90s, what I call taking it to the streets, action and engagement. And it all began with a sort of a working paper. And, you know, the service committee, American Friends Service Committee, was working hard and struggling around what to do and what its actions could be with regard to Africa, South Africa, what was going on in South Africa, but mostly Southern Africa, what was happening in Rhodesia and Zambia. And so those were some of the things that they were dealing with. They had mixed messages coming out of there and working with friends, communities in Africa coming back. But it was Bishop Tutu and others, and they did this working paper called Challenging Hope, which kind of focused the service committee, and the board said, you know what, we're going to start moving on this. We're going to take an action, and we're going to challenge in this country those relationships that provide the oppression back and forth in Africa. And so we began taking it to the streets. And one of the places that happened is we had a lot of these campaigns. And it was the Third World Coalition that took this up. It was our Peace Division. It was the Community Relation, and all the regional offices also took up these different things in campaigning. And there was education, you know, getting to know Mandela, getting to know, oh boy, the ANC and what was going on and the pressures that were happening. And so what you had was, you had the Coca-Cola divestment campaign. And that was here in Atlanta. It was really huge, what was happening. So folks were able to, in meetings, and folks were able to take action. They were able to not buy Coke. They were also able to ask all their institutions to divest from Coca-Cola corporations. Those were schools and colleges and different things. There was a learnings within communities of color that kind of brought those struggles together. And so you have these root struggles. There was this education. I mean, what I'm showing you here is the Third World Coalition's newsletter back then. And this was in 1986. And you know, there's a history, and they kind of show each year what was happening in South and Southern Africa, and a call to conscience. And these things and all of these things were happening in and around the country. And so we were challenging each other. And Bill was a major part of bringing folks together. And Bishop Tutu was major in sparking that and making these movements happen within the service committee. Bishop Tutu, as you can see here, it was in 1979, the World Coalition kind of brought them in, and they did a major work there. But Bill inspired our Africa work, and that was, it built on those movements with regard to South Africa, to Southern Africa, and all of the other movements that were going forward. And as you'll see here, our Southern Africa program was led by Jerry Herman, as you can see over here to the right. And we had a committee that was working around these, and we, service committee, it was all of those speaking towards that Bill kind of sparked, that built out, that Jerry kind of took and ran with regard to the Africa Peace Tour. It was so important that we brought folks over so that you could hear directly what the struggles were, what the issues were. And then there was these exchange programs that also were built out of that. And you will see that we connected with civil rights movement. And you have Leah Tutu was hosted as far as a tour, but also was brought here to meet Coretta Scott, Joseph Lowery, and others with regard to here. And you'll see Bill down here on the left talking with Leah. And also Bill, I was talking with Jerry Herman the other day, and it was like, you know, Bill loved, he says, yeah, I remember Bill loved jazz, but you know what Bill loved more? Dancing. He said, Bill would get out on the floor and dance. And so every time I see this picture, I see Bill dancing. And then also the protests that we took it to the streets. As you will see here in front of the South African embassy, there were daily times and daily folks could come out and be a part of it. If you were in town, you knew where to go. And those campaigns and actions were very relevant with regard to South Africa and demonstrations in front of the embassy. And then, but what you see here is that we also took part in the elections, the South African elections in 1994 as observers. And this is a report back of what they saw. And as we were invited in to be part of that effort there. And then bringing folks out and doing the Africa Peace Tour was very important. Let me, the other thing that what came about was we also came into being and created what they call the Africa Initiative. The Africa Initiative was built upon that work that Bill did. And that Africa Initiative brought together these different campaigns, working with young folk, and what also was called the Life Over Debt campaign. And what you'll see with the Life Over Debt campaign, which I think was one of our better campaigns, you'll see that Gracia Michelle, former Mozambican Minister of Education, was brought over here. And we talked about, and we used the Life Over Debt education packets during her tour. And so this was really important work, and connecting with Diane Fort and our international Africa partners as we were doing these speaking tours throughout. And so the Life Over Debt was an important campaign. And what you'll see is, you know, we had these t-shirts and stuff as we were doing it. But also, this is the most important thing that I need to say, is that the debt campaign is, these words were the things that came out of the All African Conference of Churches. And it says every child in Africa, there's a financial burden, a lifetime of work, that this debt is formed and is as vicious as any slavery that has happened in the world. And so this was an important time that we were looking at the debt that countries were just saddled with, and that this was a major problem with folks really beginning to come out of those oppressions and to provide a different space. I also want to say that also in closing, and I want to talk about the Bill Sutherland Institute. Bill Sutherland Institute is sort of working on behalf of Africa for the next generation of activists. The Institute happens over these 3-day training sessions in organizing each year. It happened in 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007, and 2008 at the US Social Forum, where Bill was really honored at the forum because as part of the sort of the Africa track in the forum, we had this big old Africa, what they called the Africa tent, where all those activities and learnings would happen. And it was Bill, it was the Bill Sutherland Institute that was there training, and we did the 3-day training with the young folks, and his contribution and participating in 2008 was one of the last times that I was able to see Bill. And it was, that beloved expression that folks had of all the work, all those connections. And Bill had these amazing connections that went all the way throughout. And as you can see, this is one of actually, you'll see all the way to the left is Nyango. And Nyango is the Associate Regional Director here in Atlanta. And she was a young activist back then, working around Africa and beyond. And so I just want to say thank you, and Sankofa, and also reflect. So that's I hope I didn't go too long, and I will stop sharing here. And introduce Joyce. And I think, Joyce, we're going to load your question, and I'm going to hand the mic to you. So thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Wow, you always amaze me. It's hard to come after you because you put out these wonderful, wonderful PowerPoints that are so visual and moving. And so I'm sorry that I don't have a PowerPoint. But it was lovely to listen and learn also from your presentation. I love the concept of Sankofa, and I'm happy that you mentioned it because it does ground even my presentation as I reflect on this question of Bill Sutherland's legacy and how does it translate into our present and future at AFSC. And so I thought long and hard about this. And I also took the opportunity to learn about Bill Sutherland, who I unfortunately have not had the chance to get to know personally. So before I delve into that, I just wanted to share that I'm truly honored to be here once again. Hal, thank you for your vision and for making way for all of us to experience and learn from the legacy of so many movement builders and change makers and extraordinary peace builders every Saturday afternoon. It's on my calendar, and I hope that everybody will join as well to learn and be inspired. And AFSC is truly honored to once again sponsor the Black Quaker Lives Matter Film Festival, and it's a joy to be with you. So as I learned about Bill Sutherland, I dug up a lot of gems from the American Friends Service Committee archive. Some of them you saw through Keith's presentation, and some of them were not there, but there's so much in terms of his history with the service committee and so much learning. And the reason I like the term Sankofa is because we really cannot move forward in our peace and justice work before we actually reflect and build on and look back at the legacies that were left before us. And so this is what this is about, isn't it? So as I dug into the archives, I found that Bill Sutherland started his relationship with the AFSC, as you heard from Keith, in the 40s. He worked in the Student Peace Service just after graduating from Bates College. He stayed in contact with the AFSC over decades, coordinating on conscientious objection support and peace and social justice work. So he was kind of loosely affiliated, but then in 1974, he formalized his role with AFSC. And at that time, he became AFSC's Southern Africa representative and worked with us for several years. And as you heard from the interview, Bill is passionate about true, deep, nonviolent change and boldly puts himself at risk many times for his conscience. A jail term of 4 years and a conscientious objector during World War II did not deter him from standing up against war. And as he said, we continue to struggle. It is part of living. And that really says it all when we think about Bill Sutherland's approach. And it reminds me of Maya Angelou's quote about courage. I use that a lot because it speaks to me when she said, "I'm convinced that courage is the most important of all virtues, because without courage, you cannot practice any other virtue consistently. You can be kind for a while, you can be generous for a while, you can be just for a while, or merciful for a while, even loving for a while. But it's only with courage that you can be persistently and insistently kind, generous, and fair." Persistently and insistently. Those words echo in my mind as I learned more about Bill Sutherland's life and work. Bill was as persistent as anyone could be. He was an amazing connector and had an inextinguishable supply of energy. Just by reading some of the material in our archives, I'm going to give you an example, and it's going to make your head spin because it made my head spin. This is a biographical sketch written in the 1970s, and I want to share his itinerary with you for just 1 year of his time at AFSC. That was in 1976. So in August, Bill was consulting with the Organization of African Unity in Ethiopia 1 month, in Mozambique to set up a medical project the next, and also a press conference in Zimbabwe. Then he traveled to Zambia to consult South African and Zimbabwean exiles. In October and November, he spent a few weeks in the same place, participating as a Quaker observer and facilitator on the Geneva Conference on the Future of Zimbabwe. The following month, he was in the administrative office in Tanzania, and then consulting East African friends in Kenya. Then he met with South African student exiles in Botswana and then in Zambia, observing the Organization of African Unity Liberation Committee meeting. And then from February through June, he toured the United States speaking about peace and apartheid in South Africa. And if that wasn't enough, he wrapped up these 12 months by organizing and leading a month-long AFSC study tour in Zambia, Botswana, Mozambique, and Tanzania, where participants met with the liberation movement leaders, refugees, religious leaders, heads of state, and many others. Wow. So I'm sure your head is spinning, trying to figure out how could all this happen in 12 months by this single person. So it takes energy to be a persistent voice for peace, dialogue, and human rights. And his efforts to bring change are extraordinary. He brought MLK to Africa. He played a critical role in the March on Washington and was instrumental in bringing Archbishop Tutu the Nobel Peace Prize. His poignant and optimistic accounts, strategies, and tactics eloquently presented with Matt Meyer's Guns and Gandhi in Africa underscored his very simple yet critical message that change needs persistence and change needs energy, but also that change is possible. There's so much optimism in this book. I hope everybody can get a chance to read it. As a staunch Pan-Africanist and an anti-apartheid activist, Bill worked tirelessly to end colonialism in Africa. While in Tanzania in the early 1960s, he became a host for anti-apartheid activists and Pan-Africanists, providing the bridge between Africans and Americans. It's an honor to be part of an organization like AFSC that's trying to keep his legacy of connection, of bridge building, of courage, of conscience, and truth, and bold truth-telling alive. I'd love to share some examples from our current work activating Quaker values for a just world. One is our newly launched Salama Hub, a new research and advocacy center founded just a few months ago in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. The Horn of Africa faces serious challenges with armed conflict and forced mass migration. Most of the discussions about policy in the region do not listen to the voices of those who live there. The same colonial and condescending approaches that Bill Sutherland tried to address. The Salama Hub is a wonderful addition to our strong ongoing commitment efforts in Africa to reverse the legacy of colonialism. The Salama Hub will be coordinating with local civil society groups from many countries to get their insights and solutions, sponsor original African-led research into vital peace, socioeconomic, and migration issues, and take these insights and policy alternatives to the governments, the South African Union, or the African Union, I should say, the United Nations, the United States, Europe, and policymakers worldwide. The new hub is a connection point, like Bill Sutherland has been in the past, for many people striving for just, peaceful, and sustainable future. Keith, you mentioned that around debt relief, we worked with the All Africa Conference of Churches, and you had that quote there on that T-shirt. And I'm like, wait a minute, but the All African Conference of Churches are our partners, our main partners for the Salama Hub. And when I was in Addis Ababa for the launch, I met the General Secretary, and we just had amazing conversations about our partnership and our history. And so I'm thrilled that we have rekindled in a very concrete way that relationship with the All Africa Conference of Churches. But, you know, in addition to the Salama Hub in the Horn of Africa, we are working in several countries in Zimbabwe on helping internally displaced persons and communities, providing humanitarian services and advocating for better migration policies in the region. We're doing trauma healing in South Sudan, helping rebuild civil society leadership in post-conflict Burundi, and supporting people who are fleeing from their homes in Somalia to find healing, shelter, and skills to live in trusted communities again. Bill was committed to a vibrant African future, self-determined by Africans, and we are here to support it, to continue that legacy. I was, as I said, just in Addis Ababa for the Salama Hub, and I go back to Kenya for the Friends United Meeting Triennials in Kenya in early July to see more of that work in action. You know, but Bill's legacy is not confined to Africa. That is not only the only way we are furthering Bill's deep legacy for social change. Let's talk about apartheid. Bill bravely spoke about it. As you heard, tour around the United States, and the world to bring attention to the social disease of apartheid in South Africa, and extended his activism to the Middle East, where he worked with the Peace Brigades International. Today, my colleagues and I at AFSC are doing the same about apartheid conditions in Palestine. Palestinians under Israeli occupation live under laws that limit their basic human rights, including where they can buy a home, what they can say, where they can go, where they can work, who can they love or marry, and other limits not imposed on Jewish Israeli citizens. Like South Africa, this is a lasting way that white supremacy and settler colonialism are justifying human rights abuses. In 2021, as we were reviewing our social investment policies, our board took the action to officially call Israel's occupation of Palestine by the name apartheid. Combining our grassroots organizing work and economic activism, we are launching a new anti-apartheid multi-phase effort. Stay tuned, we're calling it Free Apartheid Communities. More will come on that. We're very excited about this new campaign. We have been supporting divestment efforts from companies which consistently, knowingly, and directly facilitate and enable state violence and repression, war and occupation, and severe violations of international law and human rights in general, but also specifically as part of the Israeli occupation of Palestinian and Syrian lands. We saw a great victory last year from our economic activism work when General Mills pulled out of Israel altogether. We celebrate that victory, but we also know that we are challenged today with a well-oiled machine that works against us. That with a new extreme government in Israel. That is even more committed to killing Palestinian youth and rounding them up to jail. Since the beginning of this year, on average, more than one person a day has been killed in Palestine by the Israeli military machine. They continue to demolish Palestinian homes and build fortified Israeli settlements and keep all who live in Gaza in a state of siege, with little access to jobs, electricity, and basic needs of life. And we are rising to that challenge, working to connect movements against this apartheid around the world and bringing equality and economic and political activism to bear. Again, like Bill wanted us to be, connectors. And so that is something that we take to heart. We are seeing a slow but growing shift in public sentiment in this country towards Palestinian rights, and we are here to keep building that momentum. That requires dogged tenacity, a belief in the transforming power of love, faith in a better future, and the willingness to keep reaching out and making connections across borders, across boundaries. And not least, it takes energy, takes optimism that change is possible. We have so many examples. There are track records around us of how distinct approaches towards liberation have worked. They were tried and tested. And Sutherland and Mayer's book sheds light on some of these, and we need to really use those to give us more confidence and optimism that change is possible, justice is possible. I'm honored to work with tireless colleagues at AFSC who have been forging new connections and building new understandings for a peace built on the foundation of justice and respect for human rights. These are all the things Bill Sutherland excelled at, and these are a few of the many ways AFSC continues the struggle. In Bill Sutherland's words, continues the struggle It's part of our living. I love that. We are propelled by his legacy, and we will continue with persistence, with love, with energy, with courage, and also with humility. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. I want to welcome Matt Myers, Dr. Matt Myers, who has joined us now. He's online. And Cooper, can you pull up Matt's question? And hopefully, Matt, you can, because Matt has this amazing personal relationship with Bill and can go into really wonderful detail. So, Matt, the mic is yours.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So first of all, amazing, but yet not in some ways wholly surprising. I do feel tremendously honored to be here, tremendously honored to follow Joyce, a dear sister who's not an easy speaker to follow. But also I feel like I'm sort of in the middle of doing a profoundly Bill Sutherland thing. Which is, of course, I couldn't say no to this. And of course, I was scheduled to be in some far off corner, not just, dipping down in a major capital in a country that's, very stable, but I'm in Burkina Faso. I'm here because when I was to be here last October, there was a coup d'etat in this country 2 days before my flight was supposed to take off. So we rescheduled for now. And I'm not in the capital. I'm outside of the capital by a good number of hours and miles. And yet, the idea of doing this seemed wholly possible. Just to be sure, we did the video that you saw introducing Bill's video because we suspected I wouldn't get here on time to good Wi-Fi before this part of the show. And yet here I am, just here in enough time to hear Joyce. And what a joy to be here. What a joy to celebrate and think about Bill and his legacy in the context of Africa and the whole world. But also I think the main thing to say, listening to what Joyce said, knowing some of what Keith and of course our dear Hal, have been thinking about in building this, that Bill was a man devoted to organizing. He was a man devoted to the idea that building movement amongst all peoples was the key and is the key towards social change. So yes, he worked for the American Friends Service Committee at a time when Africa wasn't necessarily central. It's a lovely legacy that in the years following, he, helped, obviously, to have AFSC, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, promote the prize for Bishop Tutu, who then ultimately got it, and for the rest of his life considered AFSC and Bill one of the main reasons he had that platform as Archbishop and as a key leader of so many things that Archbishop Tutu led, including work for a free Palestine. So to have AFSC now led by such an extraordinary Palestinian voice, I will say also, some of you know, that I just came back from coordinating with a number of different bodies, my own organization. I'm the Secretary General of the International Peace Research Association, IPRA, the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, War Resistance International, International Peace Bureau, and others, put together a series of conferences and meetings in the world's newest country, South Sudan. Peace and nonviolence can best be learned by people who have been in conflict and who are struggling with the ongoing effects, not just of direct war, but of institutional violence and conflict in general. So we brought people and we went to Juba, and lo and behold, out of Juba, the International Fellowship of Reconciliation elected as their president a Palestinian voice. So this is only a symbolic piece, but the idea that Palestine and all still colonized people, whether they be from West Papua or Western Sahara, Palestine or Puerto Rico, Kashmir or Tibet, wherever colonized people still remain, many the forefront of our movements and our organizations for peace and nonviolence. Are you hearing me fine?
Yes.
Okay, I'm just going to take that yes and keep going.
Yes.
So I feel like the actions happening in our organizations like AFSC, International FOR, all the others I mentioned, and so many others at the grassroots level throughout Africa and throughout the whole world echo this vision, this way of life, this not particularly unique, but very, very stalwart way of being of Bill Sutherland. And that is organize, organize, organize. That was also said by Kwame Ture, a younger Pan-Africanist, Stokely Carmichael. And the idea that building organization was key was central to the work we're doing, the work you heard Joyce, poignantly talk about in specificity, the work we did in Juba, and the work I'm doing here now in Burkina Faso. I want to note also that I'm here with a dear Latin American colleague from Colombia, another place of conflict, but also of renewal and revitalization and struggle. And in addition to really being here as students, we're also looking at building what will be a major Pan-American, Pan-Africanist event in Trinidad in May. So I'm putting into the chat the link towards the IPRA Global Conference. And these are all places and spaces, just as little examples, few among many, that echo the Bill Sutherland legacy of building organization and fighting for justice for all. I put down a few concrete things about what personified Bill, and so I'm going to say them, though I really hate to read anything, and I want to quickly get to the Q&A and hear from all of you. But I think first and foremost, it's important to note that Bill was a humanist more than a religious activist at any point. He was a Quaker. He was part of the student Christian movement. I think that's been mentioned. But really, his commitment was a commitment to the spirit of people and people's spirituality in a very general and, like his other politics, very non-sectarian way. So he was never committed to the trappings of a given theology, a given religion, or a given ideology. And that non-sectarianism stayed with him throughout his whole life. One of the big problems he had at AFSC, to be perfectly honest, was he insisted that because the United Nations and the peoples of South Africa themselves hadn't chosen between whether the ANC or the PAC, the Pan-Africanist Congress, would be the official representative of the people of South Africa or ZANU, so he supported both at a time when many in the movement were going in one direction or the other. Bill was committed to the ethics and strategic possibilities of nonviolence, of course, but he was never committed to the dogmatic adherence to a particular ideological or tactical absolutism. He was anti-absolutism. So the idea that if you were engaged in armed struggle, you somehow weren't pure enough or good enough to talk to was anathema to his very being. It would have been the opposite of what he did and wanted to do, not just in the later periods of his life, but when he, after his work in Ghana and with Dr. Martin Luther King, after his work in Beirut and with building the Peace Brigades International, after his early years in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, when he moved there in the early to mid 60s and was a host, chauffeur to Minister Malcolm X, Al-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. After all that, he was known as the person that you went to listen to cool American jazz and talk openly about the real intractable, tough issues of strategies and tactics. And I'm not talking just the guy on the street, or of course the guy and the girl on the street, men and women, were always welcome, whatever stature. But I'm talking about the top leadership of the armed movements of that time, Frelimo of Mozambique and the leaders of MPLA. He was, particularly close to the folks who became the presidents and vice presidents of Namibia. He was close to the leadership of SWAPO. And all of those movements and all of those individuals who were living in the frontline state of Tanzania went to Bill and his cookouts to have some hangout time and to recognize that this single grassroots Quaker pacifist African-American had a lot to talk about and a lot to learn from and a lot to teach, because he'd be a stalwart solidarity activist even if they didn't always agree on a given tactic or a given strategy or a given belief in absolute nonviolence or armed struggle is the only way to win the fight. No, absolutism went out the door when you hung out with Bill Sutherland. Bill was committed to living life fully with love, with positive action, a term that Kwame Nkrumah, of course, used, with resistance, with resilience, with sports. I mentioned the leadership of SWAPO. He was a tennis player, not anywhere near professional, but he played tennis with these guys. One of the leaders of ZANU, Nathan Shimurira. I mean, they talked politics, and there were all these issues with Zimbabwe before and after independence. But whatever was happening, when they could, he and Nathan got in a good round of tennis. But the idea that sports, music, and again, love, living life fully with love was central to the way one was in the world in order to make social change. You had to also have some fun. Bill had a commitment to an unflinching and unbordered internationalism, without the trappings of reliance on nation states or bureaucratic structures, and very much with an emphasis on grassroots economic, political, and sociocultural liberation. Obviously, Bill was a great supporter of the independent nation states of Africa. But he also understood that people's power, that people-to-people communication was the real thing that made change in the world. And of course, as has been said and can't be overlooked, Bill was an internationalist. He was absolutely someone who always connected his homeland, the US, with all its faults and foibles, with the rest of the world and with his African colleagues and friends and comrades. But his central ideology, if anything, his central belief system was in Pan-Africanism. The idea that in a multi-centered world that we needed to build, we must nonetheless understand, appreciate, and take leadership from a united vision and practice of African peoples and their allies. The idea that somehow in Africa, there was both a politics and a spirit of change, of living, and of being nonviolent, and of being peaceful, and of being pro-justice. That never left him. And even though some would scoff and say, oh, what's so special about Africa? He would come back to example after example. And so groups like the Black Quaker Project epitomize that continuity. And this amazing coming together that project and our beloved Hal have hosted for us speaks to not Bill Sutherland, the man, but the legacy of all that Bill's life symbolized and the echoes that we have to continue to listen for in our daily work.
Thank you, Matt. I think now we open it up to questions and answers. I think Cooper's going to lead us through that.
Yeah. Cooper takes it, please.
Thank you, Hal.
And by the way, Matt, thank you, Matt, Keith, and Joyce, for each of your enlightening presentations. Absolutely fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. And I hope we can follow this up with some more discussion and more, what actions do we need to take? What actions do we need to take? Cooper, it's all yours now to coordinate the Q&A for our audience, please.
Thank you, Hal. So for the Q&A today, please enter your questions with names to a specific panelist who you might want to direct it to in the question and answer chat that you should see at the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. You can direct it to one of our panelists specifically or to all of them. I'll read out the questions to the panelists and reiterate who they're directed to. And also be sure to let us know where you are, who you are, where you're from, and we apologize, but we will not have time to get to everyone's questions, but we will be sure to save them. And if you would like to be subscribed to our mailing list, please leave your email with your consent to be added in our chat for updates on further screenings. Okay, I have one question in the chat right now. All of you can begin entering more, and I'll continue reading them off as we go. Okay, the first question is from Jeremy Street. Why are we being informed these countries are in West Africa? Oops, my apologies, that is not appropriate. Okay, let me see if. All right, we're still waiting on some questions right now. If any of you have any questions about the video program or any of our panelists' presentations, just feel free to enter them in the chat. And
Matt, I have a personal question I'm just going to throw at you because I was talking to Jerry Herman, and I mean, I know about Bill and his jazz, which I love, but I also heard that Bill was a dancer. I heard he enjoyed dancing, like really dancing. Just wanted to follow up on that.
To be sure, I wasn't really up for. I was enough of a mentee for most of my time, and of course, I think I may have mentioned in the intro, Bill had these different parts of my life as mentor, and then as colleague, and then as stepdad. So I never submitted myself to being beat by him at tennis. We did listen to jazz together, but to be clear, I never danced with Bill. But yes, Bill was an avid dancer. One could say, and I say this as a person who, he and my mom were together for almost a decade before they both passed several months apart from each other. And of course, his beloved wife from Ghana, F. was Sutherland. But Bill was a little bit of a ladies' man, one might say, and dancing was a key part of that. So yeah, between relationships, Bill would go out dancing, and that is true. I will say no more because we are out of time with that question. No, that's not the reason. No.
Thank you. Our next question is actually for you again, Dr. Meyer. It is from Jim Barron. Was Bill Sutherland's pacifism based on the Quaker peace testimony? Did he have a spiritual practice? Did he believe that we can directly communicate with God for deeper understanding of the peace testimony?
Wow, what a great question. I think I have to say that it was that there's an evolutionary answer to that question. So he, I think he talked about, again, it's been a little while since I saw the film and I've been traveling. So this last week, things have been shaking around in my brain, but there's no question that building as a young man into taking conscientious objector status during World War II, that was based on his spiritual Christian and Quaker beliefs. So all of those things tied together at that time, for sure. In the years after getting out of prison, 45 to 50, 53, I think those things were still fairly significant and present for him. When he moved to Gold Coast, when he moved to Accra and then met Efwa, they were married, they raised a family, they were out of Accra for a time in other parts of what was become Ghana. I think looking at different African spiritual forms that included African Christianity, but weren't as maybe directly related to the way you phrase some of that question. And then I think as the years went on, his nonviolence became more what I would call nuanced. It's not that that spirituality evaporated or changed in a way that he no longer subscribed to it. But I think really in those later decades, especially looking at, I mean, I think there's this period that the world went through, especially after Dr. King was killed, where certainly at this point, Bill didn't, like some, think nonviolence is dead just because Dr. King was killed. But the challenges to what could be done nonviolently were so fierce. And so many people, especially on the continent, which he was now deeply involved with through the Pan-Africanist Congresses, but also through his own daily work in the Tanzanian government with Julius Nyerere and others, the questions about the usefulness of nonviolence at this moment, after so much of the continent was free, but also during and in the midst of the tenacity of Portuguese colonialism in Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, etc. Rhodesia and the struggle for independence of Zimbabwe, South Africa, apartheid, and Southwest Africa. They raise challenges where, on the one hand, Bill would say, as we said in our book, nonviolence doesn't mean stupidity. Like, it doesn't mean that you do one nonviolent action, it doesn't bring about the entire liberation of the people, and so you say nonviolence has failed. Well, that's just stupid. But on the other hand, it doesn't require a rigidity. It requires discipline. It requires a kind of training that one needs as if you were training for a military action. You just don't use the guns. So it requires a certain amount of absolute training. It requires a steadfastness. But all of those things went beyond, I think, the Christian pacifist construct of the question. And so I think I would say his nonviolence deepened and developed, not taking away that earlier stuff, but building on it in a more nuanced, perhaps you'd say a more tactical, some would say the word revolutionary nonviolence. A lot of my writing has been on revolutionary nonviolence, whatever that means. In fact, I shouldn't think about giving a plug, but it's hard not to see Joyce's face here. So there's a new book I just co-edited with a dear sister named Wendy Marshall called Insurrectionary Uprisings, a reader in revolutionary nonviolence and decolonization. And we got this amazing Palestinian woman to write the introduction. Yes, it's Joyce Ajlani right here. So yes, I think that idea of a revolutionary nonviolence went maybe not beyond, but went in tandem with those earlier beliefs that were more religious or theologically based. I hope that answers your question.
Cooper, may I just add one word?
Yes.
When I spoke with Bill Sutherland a few months before his death by telephone, I asked him the question, "Are you a Quaker? Are you a Quaker?" And his response was, "I am a fellow traveler."
Yes, a beautiful dodge. Yes, and not yes, but not yes. He had tremendous affinity for AFSC and for Quakers and for all the contradictions that he understood.
Thank you, Dr. Mott.
I think he'd be very happy with AFSC today. I think he'd be very happy with Joyce and with everything Joyce said. He'd certainly be, a little embarrassed and thrilled with the spotlight here. But it's not just about the spotlight. It's about, what Keith brings to the table, Cooper and Susan and the other organizers of it, what you're bringing together to the table, this energy to talk about Africa, to think about Black Quakerism, Palestinian Quakerism. I mean, there's no question he'd be completely thrilled about that, not because he was being spotlighted, that he'd be embarrassed by, but because this is the work.
Our next question is from Kathy from Manasquan, New Jersey meeting, and it's for Joyce. I'm curious what other companies have been involved in divestment campaigns in Israel?
Great question. I'm going to send you to our website where we actually screen all the companies. So it's hard to share with you all of that, but we have a website called Investigate. So if you just Google AFSC Investigate, you will go to that website where you can screen investments and look at company profiles. It really highlights the companies that have been profiting from military occupation of Palestine, but we've recently gone beyond that as well. I'd like to make a pitch for that because it's really amazing work. It has also, it's also looking at companies that are complicit and profiting from the prison industrial complex, from the border, militarization of borders, etc. So I urge everyone on this call to go and screen your investments or your company's investments or your against that. So Investigate AFSC is the tool that we have, and you can see profiles and the research. We have an amazing team who sits in Oakland, California, who do this work, and it's truly groundbreaking. So I hope that you take full advantage of it.
Thank you. Our next question is from Pax Asma Given, apologies if I did not pronounce that right, from San Francisco meeting. And this is for all of the panelists. How do we counter the epidemic of gun violence in the US when so many Americans seem to view gun ownership as not only a constitutional, but a God-given right?
I certainly think an easy question like that, Keith shouldn't be given the answer because Joyce and I have already been asked questions before.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it.
Yeah, sorry.
It's okay. You know, that's a hard one, but I find that it's going to take some time. It's not going to be a major, like an overnight kind of thing. And the only sort of history experience that I have where that kind of change happened was oddly in Northern Ireland. And it was a generational change. It's one of those things where the young folks, this next generation is the ones that are going to take up the piece of, we got to get rid of these guns. They are being massively affected. The schools are a parent's almost nightmare, in fear sometimes. But it is those young activists that are rising up, coming of age, that I think are going to make that big change. It's not going to be around the corner. It could be a couple decades from now. But that's where real change happens, and we need to provide that support. Alter other ways of conflict resolution, and how we handle our anger and different things, dealing with the racism and those kind of white supremacy kind of things that all these folks have these guns and different communities. This, I mean, just a little family argument can cause real death. And so that's where I have always wanted to work. And that's where, when, you know, within Service Committee and so many other organizations, it's those young people bringing sort of a different way of handling conflict, a different way of seeing the future and their world that we need to be able to provide support and guidance with.
I can piggyback on that. Keith said it brilliantly, and I think we all do our piece, right? And AFSC continues to challenge narrative and policies around that. But I want to look at there was a question related to what Keith was mentioning about the youth and the adults that we work with. And there's a question, sorry, Cooper, but I'm going to take that one because it's related. What are the strands of training in the current aims of youth programming and activism across continents does AFSC seek to build upon from Bill Sutherland's legacy? Thanks, Pam, for that question. And I think it's exactly what Bill is asking us to do, is to do the connection. We have a global youth network of youth from across our programs in the United States and across the globe that meet regularly to discuss the issues that they are dealing with. We believe that the youth have the answers, and we need to provide them with the platform and facilitate that exchange. And I think that is one thing that we are doing at AFSC, is offering this broad network of youth to come together to think through what has worked for them and in their context, and how they can learn from each other, and how can they build the movement together. We have a huge program, hopefully, that's going to start up in Asia around youth activism as well. And so how do we bring those voices in? And I think AFSC is in a special place where we are working globally, but we have very strong programs with youth and otherwise in the United States as well. And so how do we make those connections and intersections?
Thank you. I'll direct our next question to Dr. Meyer from Sachiko Komagata in Ewing, New Jersey. How did you become acquainted with Bill and ultimately wrote a book together?
And I saw another question about Bill's Quakerism, which I was really, beginning to look up because I found it fascinating, because I didn't know the answer quickly, but I think I know it now. So it has a lot to do, maybe a little bit more to do with my story than I'd like to tell, but essentially, I became a draft registration resistor in 1980. And decided to go public as such. I was born and raised in New York City. I still work in New York. And though I don't know if mainly what I do is go to sleep sometimes in New York, I seem to work everywhere else. But when I plunged into political work as an undergraduate and as a budding young activist, one of the groups that most struck me was this radical nonviolent group, War Resisters League. And shortly thereafter, a Fellowship of Reconciliation came on my radar. And I also became a bit of a coalition builder as part of, I think, being in New York and being an internationalist. And just by nature, my parents weren't activists. And a very intense conference that I went to at the end of 1982, after being the student representative to the major anti-nuclear march, June 12th of that year, where 1 million people came to New York as part of the UN Special Session on Disarmament. But a major conference that was to, in many ways, change my life, which was my first international conference, shocked me. And it's worth mentioning this because it shocked me into my connection with Bill, but its issues, I think, still are with us today. It showed me the possibility of an internationalism where people from all over the world, speaking all different languages, with all these different great posters and pendants and pamphlets that I couldn't read, were speaking with one voice about nonviolence and social change and peace and justice. And yet, there were very, very few people there from Latin America. Maybe even fewer from the Middle East. There were 2 people from Asia, both elders in the Gandhian movement. Okay, that's as easy as can be in a group on nonviolence. And there were exactly 0 people from the continent of Africa. And immediately this struck me as something impossibly wrong. It didn't hurt that many of the Black Vietnam veterans who had been part of the movement in the late 60s and 70s were amongst those folks who counseled the 1980 era of draft registration resistors, that we had to make sure we didn't repeat some of the racist mistakes of the previous resistance movement. Feminists, including Grace Paley, gave us the same warning about patriarchy and male-centeredness. And all of these things came to my mind where I came back from that conference at the end of 1982 and said, what's up with Africa? I know there's stuff going on. I became an African studies major, and all of a sudden I stopped not knowing what I was doing in college and had a vision what I should do academically. And I also said, what's happening on the ground? And this actually, if you want me to answer the question I saw in the chat about Bill's Quakerism, it connects to that as well, because Bill's connection to the movements of the states also related, and this is one of those great feminist personal is political stories, with his connections with people. So his fellow World War II COs, Ralph de Gia, Dave Dellinger, Bayard Rustin, and others were always a part of his life. And Ralph de Gia was on staff of War Resisters League till the end of his life. And I was a young buck in that organization. And Ralph said, War Resisters, peace, nonviolence, and now you're asking all these questions about Africa. You should really, I should introduce you to this dude. And suddenly we became pen pals. Because remember, this is before the internet, and long, messages stamped to Dar es Salaam, and then I would get messages back from him from Dar es Salaam, became a many, many year back and forth, to the extent that Ralph, his buddy from the 1940s, said, how is it that you're getting more mail than I've ever gotten in my entire life? And so ultimately we became mentor and mentee. I think I mentioned already when we developed together the project that became Guns and Gandhi in Africa. He refused to let me be a secondary partner, he said this book has to be a book from our different but united perspectives about strategies and tactics. And we have to be co-authors and collaborators. So we went from that. And then at the end of this 30-year period, he came to New York, complete surprise to me, and started going out with my mom. So yes, from pen pal to mentor to colleague and co-presenter and co-author to stepdad. That's the decades I had with Bill. I was very privileged.
Cooper, I think there's time for only one more question.
Okay, I will, for the last question, this is from Ronnie from Oakland, for Keith and Hal. Does the anti-absolutist way of being embodied by Bill Sutherland have guidance for us here in the United States, as an anti-violence stance can fail to consider the structural violence experienced moment to moment by many?
Harold, I want you to jump in on that one first.
Well, I think, Keith, we're going to answer that because we're going to do a presentation on structural violence as a postscript. So if you would like to answer that, that would be fine.
Okay.
Then we can move on to the postscript, which deals with structural violence.
Okay. Much like what Bill had done in his relationships with folks, being in the room, even though, that struggle for liberation took up there was an armed struggle part, but those folks wanted to still have Bill in the room. And I think in the US, we had a similar kind of experience in understanding and working around the struggles that came out of actually Oakland and the Black Panthers. And folks wanted to be able to support the Black Panthers because, their 10-point plan and what they were saying spoke to us. The armed peace became a issue, and there was a split in some ways in some of the movements there. And so that's an ongoing question that we need to think about. But I just know from sort of Bill's experience that those relationships that he had of folks who were trying to work for liberation appreciated Bill being in the room, appreciate that other perspective as they were strategizing and figuring ways forward, but that all of those understandings needed to be in the room for the full liberation of people. And so, yeah, I saw that question earlier, Cooper. I didn't know if you were going to ask it, but that's an important one and a hard one, I think, for us sometimes.
And let's hope that we can continue to respond to that as the days and months and years go ahead of us. I want to thank all of you for your meaningful questions. I suspect that if there were more time, you would have additional questions for these well-informed guest experts. So now we move into the postscript. As a postscript to today's presentation, we're sharing a bit of our ministry's work on structural violence. As you recall, Bill notes in his interview the phrase institutional violence. I would like to share a quote from Bill Sutherland and Matt Meyer in their book, Guns and Gandhi, that we reprinted in our anthology, Black Fire, African-American Quakers on Spirituality and Human Rights, summarizing Bill Sutherland's approach to structural violence. And you can read it with me if you would like. Our main concerns have been the overwhelming structural and institutional roots of conflict. Get this, what are they? Racism, sexism, and capitalism, which in themselves constitute the greatest violence of our times. Let me repeat that. Our major concerns have been the overwhelming structural and institutional roots of conflict, such as racism, sexism, and capitalism, which in themselves constitute the greatest violence of our times. I will now ask Sue Spina, our senior research assistant, to share the importance of our recognizing and defining structural violence, and thus our insistence on the need for anti-violence, not merely non-violence, in the solution to overcoming structural violence.
Thank you, Hal.
And we have slide number 8.
Thanks, Hal. I'm really excited to be with you all here today to share some of the Black Quaker Project's research and thinking about structural violence and the need for anti-violence. And I'm pulling a lot of this information from our 2020 publication, if you can see it here, the Pendle Hill pamphlet, Race, Systemic Violence, and Retrospective Justice, an African-American Quaker scholar activist challenges conventional narratives. So what is structural violence? We pull our definition of structural violence from the 1981 Swarthmore lecture by peace studies scholar friend Adam Curl, who defines structural violence as, quote, the political and economic inequalities which are built into the social structure. We need not be violent people, liking to inflict pain on others, to operate the violence of the system. We are simply conditioned not to see it, or, if we do, to feel we cannot change it. So in what ways do we see structural violence manifest? Hal mentioned a couple forms that Bill Sutherland and Matt Meyer mentioned in their own writing, but we're able to identify a few more structural violence forms as well. And we draw on another influential Palestinian Quaker, Jean Zarou, who published and defined several categories of structural violence in her 2008 book, Occupied with Nonviolence. She identified 5 forms of violence that affected Palestinians, and we added 2 additional categories that we feel affect African Americans in the US today. These categories, which you can see on screen, are economic structural violence, political, cultural, religious, and environmental, and then we added the categories of health and educational. This is the full form of all the forms of structural violence that we identify, and within the pamphlet, we identify even more specific examples within the context of the US. So how do we confront these forms of structural violence? What the BQP advocates is using anti-violence. Quote, "Direct violence is a symptom of systemic violence. Violence must be treated at its roots if we are to abolish it. Just as a doctor must treat the root causes of an illness, not merely the symptoms, so must we act similarly as social, progressive, analytical activists. We must be anti-violent, not merely non-violent." If you're interested in learning more about structural violence and anti-violence, this is really just the tip of the iceberg, but we wanted to touch on it today as it related to a lot of Bill Sutherland's work. We would recommend that you check out our website, theblackquakerproject.org, and again, our pamphlet through Pendle Hill, Race, Systemic Violence, and Retrospective Justice. I now hand the mic back to Hal.
Thank you, Sue, for this postscript on structural violence and the need for anti-violence to counter it. We hope our audience will be challenged by this and will continue to reflect on its importance. I want to thank everyone so much for participating in this inaugural event of the second Black Quaker Lives Matter Film Festival and Forum. Thank you to our incredible guest experts, Joyce, Keith, and Matt, and to our incredible festival co-sponsor, the American Friends Service Committee. Thank you again to Rick Tejada Flores and Judith Eldrick for allowing us to screen their work today, and to the Washington University in St. Louis for providing us with material from their archives. Thanks to our talented Black Quaker Project team, Cooper Vaughn and Sue Spina in Philadelphia, for their technical support and expertise. And thanks to all of you who have joined us today. 2 weeks from now, the next of our festival forum will focus on African Americans in Quaker institutions. And we will be honoring Joan Countryman, a long-term teacher and administrator in Quaker schools, as well as at Oprah Winfrey's Academy in South Africa. So hopefully we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Meanwhile, we encourage you to visit our website and to check out the other amazing human beings whom we will be honoring and celebrating every other Saturday over the next 8 weeks. Peace and blessings, friend. One love. Until we meet again. Thank you very much again for participating.